Collapse of an Empire, Lessons for Modern Russia by Yegor Gaidar is a thought-provoking analysis that examines the downfall of the Soviet Union and its implications for Russia and the broader post-Soviet space. In this work, Gaidar reflects on the reasons behind the collapse of the Soviet Empire and how contemporary Russia can learn from the events that led to its disintegration. The book not only dissects the political, economic, and social failures that precipitated the Soviet Union's collapse, but also offers insights into the lessons that Russia and other post-Soviet states can take away from this historical moment. Historical context. Yegor Gaidar, an economist and politician, was one of the architects of Russia's economic reforms during the 1990s, serving as the country's prime minister in the early years following the Soviet collapse. He played a central role in Russia's transition from a state-controlled to a market-oriented economy. Gaidar's expertise and first-hand experience with the post-Soviet reform process provide a unique perspective on the causes and consequences of the Soviet Union's collapse. In Collapse of an Empire, Gaidar looks back at the Soviet system and the internal and external factors that led to its breakdown, offering a critical evaluation of the decisions made by Soviet leadership in the years leading up to its demise. The collapse of the Soviet Union, internal and external factors. Gaidar argues that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not simply the result of external pressures, such as the arms race with the United States or the decline of the global communist movement. While these factors certainly played a role, Gaidar emphasizes that the Soviet system was internally flawed and unsustainable. The Soviet Union's command economy, its centralized political system, and its ideological rigidity all contributed to a growing disillusionment among its citizens and an inability to address the challenges of the modern world. One of the major internal factors that Gaidar identifies is the inefficiency of the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union's centrally planned economy was unable to adapt to the changing global environment. The leadership's focus on heavy industry and military production left little room for consumer goods and services, leading to widespread shortages and dissatisfaction among the population. This economic stagnation was compounded by the inability of the Soviet leadership to implement meaningful reforms. Gorbachev's efforts at restructuring through perestroika came too late, and the reforms were insufficient to address the deep structural problems within the system. In addition to economic stagnation, Gaidar highlights the political rigidity of the Soviet system. The lack of political pluralism and the concentration of power in the hands of a small elite created a system that was unresponsive to the needs and demands of the population. As the Soviet Union faced increasing economic and social pressures, the leadership was unable to make the necessary adjustments. The political system was too hierarchical and authoritarian to allow for meaningful dialogue or change. Gorbachev's attempts at political reform, such as glasnost, openness, were intended to open up the political system, but ultimately led to the erosion of the Soviet state's legitimacy and its eventual collapse. Another key internal factor was the ethnic and regional tensions within the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic state, and many of its republics had distinct national identities and aspirations. Over time, these ethnic and regional tensions became more pronounced, and the Soviet government struggled to manage the diverse interests of its constituent republics. Gaidar notes that the failure to address these tensions contributed to the unraveling of the Soviet Union, as republics like the Baltics, Ukraine, and Georgia sought independence in the face of declining central authority. Externally, Gaidar also points to the pressures of the Cold War, particularly the arms race with the United States, as a contributing factor. The Soviet Union's military expenditures were unsustainable, and the economic burden of competing with the West in terms of military spending strained the Soviet economy. The collapse of oil prices in the 1980s further exacerbated the economic crisis, as the Soviet Union relied heavily on oil exports to finance its economy. The combination of internal inefficiencies and external pressures created a perfect storm that led to the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. In the second part of the book, Gaidar turns his attention to the lessons that modern Russia can learn from the collapse of the Soviet Union. He argues that Russia's future will depend on its ability to own the challenges that led to the Soviet Union's downfall. one of the key lessons he draws is the need for economic reform and diversification. Gaidar emphasizes that Russia cannot rely solely on oil and gas exports to sustain its economy. While these resources have provided significant revenue, they are not a sustainable long-term solution. Russia must invest in diversifying its economy, modernizing its industries, and fostering innovation. Another critical lesson Gaidar highlights is the importance of political reform. Russia, he argues, must move away from a centralized, authoritarian system of governance and embrace political pluralism, transparency, and accountability. He acknowledges that this will be a difficult task, given Russia's historical legacy of autocratic rule, but he stresses that without political reform, Russia will not be able to adapt to the demands of the modern world. Gaidar argues that a more open and democratic political system is essential for fostering the kind of creativity and innovation that will drive Russia's economic development. Furthermore, Gaidar stresses the importance of addressing Russia's regional and ethnic diversity. Like the Soviet Union, modern Russia is a multi-ethnic state, and the tensions that exist between different ethnic groups and regions must be addressed. He notes that the central government must work to ensure that all regions and ethnic groups feel that their interests are represented and respected. Failure to address these issues, Gaidar warns, could lead to the disintegration of Russia, just as ethnic and regional tensions contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Gaidar also reflects on the role of ideology in the collapse of the Soviet Union. He argues that the Soviet leadership's commitment to a rigid Marxist-Leninist ideology prevented it from responding effectively to the changing world. In the same way, Russia must avoid being bound by ideological dogmas and must remain open to new ideas and approaches. Gaidar suggests that Russia should embrace pragmatism in its approach to governance and policy-making, learning from the mistakes of the past and adapting to the realities of the present. In addition to focusing on internal reforms, Gaidar also considers the role of the international community in Russia's future. He argues that Russia's relationship with the West is crucial to its development. In particular, Gaidar advocates for greater integration with global markets and institutions. He believes that Russia can benefit from greater engagement with the international community, particularly in areas such as trade, investment, and technology. However, he also cautions that Russia must avoid isolationism and must work to build constructive relationships with its neighbors and the broader world. Gaidar acknowledges that Russia's history and geopolitical position present unique challenges. Russia's vast territory, its regional conflicts, and its complex relationship with neighboring states all pose obstacles to its development. Nonetheless, he remains optimistic that Russia can overcome these challenges if it learns from the mistakes of the Soviet Union and embraces a more open, democratic, and economically diverse future. Collapse of an Empire: Lessons for Modern Russia is a critical and reflective work that offers valuable insights into the causes of the Soviet Union's collapse and the lessons that can be learned for modern Russia. Through his analysis of the Soviet collapse, Gaidar emphasizes the importance of economic diversification, political reform, and attention to ethnic and regional tensions. He also stresses the need for Russia to remain open to global engagement and pragmatic in its approach to governance. Ultimately, Gaidar's work serves as both a warning and a call to action, urging Russia to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past and to build a more sustainable and inclusive future.